Greetings, brothers and sisters. Hello and welcome back to Eva's House of Spirit. For those of you who are newer to this channel, I'm Eva, and welcome back to my 13 Days of Samhain series. Also, welcome back to my kitchen. There's a reason why sometimes I shoot videos in my kitchen. It's not that I'm too lazy to find an interesting backdrop. It's that I consider the kitchen to be sort of the modern heart of the home. I consider, the stove to be the modern day, like, hearth. The modern day fire pit or fireplace, kind of, I guess you could say. And, in the same way that historically the hearth was the place where people would, usually the women of the house would prepare meals and so on and so forth. That's what the modern day stove, that's the modern hearth as far as I'm concerned. I do have a wood-burning stove, but I don't consider my living room to be the heart of the home. I consider the kitchen more so to be the heart of the home. So that's why I choose my kitchen for certain videos. I feel that it is sort of the witchiest room in the house, one of the witchiest rooms. But anyway, I'm kind of going off on a bit of a tangent. Just wanted to explain that in case any of you were ever like, hey, I wonder why she chooses the kitchen. So, today's topic is going to be shadow work. But before I get into what I want to say on shadow work, I do want to clarify that I am no expert on shadow work. So I do urge you all to take the things that I say naturally with a grain of salt, as you should take anything that anyone says. I do encourage that you do your own further research aside from watching this video. Don't take this to be like the be-all and end-all of the topic of shadow work. Another thing I'd like to touch upon before continuing on into this topic is that I have a channel that I'd like to recommend for those of you who are interested in pursuing the process of shadow work. Kelly Ann Maddox's channel would probably be an excellent resource for those of you who are interested in this topic. Kelly Ann is a counselor. She has a good understanding of psychology. She also seems to have a great deal of experience in the realm of shadow work. She seems to have a lot of valid and helpful, insightful things to say in regard to this topic. Her channel features some great videos in this regard on the topic of shadow work. It's not all that she talks about. She has videos on various enriching, excellent, topics. I just think that this is definitely something that you might want to check out because she does say quite a lot on the subject of shadow work. So I will have the link to her channel below for those of you who are interested, for those of you who might have not yet checked out her channel. That's not your witchy link of the day. It's just something that I feel would complement the discussion that we're having. So at this point in the video, I think it makes sense for me to begin by answering or trying to answer one of the first questions a lot of you might have, that being, what exactly is shadow work? It's a term that many of us may have heard, but not all of us may quite have a solid sort of or decent understanding of. So what I would say on that is that in my experience, shadow work is a process in which and through which we seek to bring ourselves into better overall balance. In shadow work, we particularly seek to address shadow aspects of the self. It's sort of like holding up a metaphorical mirror to the truth of our natures. And once we come to acknowledge parts of our beings that aren't serving us well, that might need closure or perhaps integration, we can then begin to identify what our needs are in relation to bringing things into better alignment. This is essentially a process of healing, but it's one that requires honesty. We can't heal what we deny. In shadow work, we have to own our shit, so to speak, before we can begin to work on it. Now, I would also like to point out, however, that while we are looking, from a brutally honest standpoint, while we're looking at, as I said before, the truth of our natures, I don't feel that shadow work should be a time where we, obsess over our shortcomings, where we like belittle ourselves or cultivate a sense of guilt over not being perfect. And also, I don't feel that shadow work should be some kind of a justification of unhealthy or harmful thoughts or actions. It's not like it's not meant, I feel, to be a sort of pass to not be functional. That's not the point of it at all. I feel it's really not the point of shadow work to be like, oh, it's okay if you're doing harmful things to yourself or others, or it's okay to not be balanced or integrated or whatever. That it's okay. It's not meant to be like, oh, it's okay that you are not a whole, functional, healthy person coming from a stable place because X, Y, and Z. That's not what it's meant to be. I really strongly believe shadow work is meant to be a process through which, as I said before, and in which we really sort of seek to gather ourselves into a greater, more functional, healthier whole. The next question that I think naturally arises when addressing or exploring the topic of shadow work is, how exactly do we go about shadow work? And this one is a little trickier to answer. The reason being that, I've come to find that shadow work as a process will be different for each individual. The reason being that we are all individual. Our shadow selves will be different. They will be as unique as we are. Our needs in shadow work will vary from person to person, so my process will not necessarily be like your process, and your process will not necessarily be like the process that might best suit someone else. So do keep that in mind. There's no real right or wrong way to approach shadow work. It's just do what helps you to identify and address, integrate, heal, find closure in respect to parts of your shadow self that need attention. I will suggest that it's probably a good idea, if you are able to work with a counselor or a therapist, it's probably a good idea to seek that kind of help in doing shadow work. You don't necessarily have to share with them that you're a witch, or a magical practitioner of whatever sort. You don't necessarily have to sit there and divulge all of that to them. That's really up to you if you want to divulge that. I personally find maybe they don't need to know that. That's sort of an aside, but they will help you to explore and work on deep things, issues, whatever, that might not be in alignment. And that's a part of shadow work. Being that therapists or counselors are, professionally trained in being able to sort of guide you through that aspect of the process, I suggest, if it's something that is within your realm to seek out, to, if you have that ability to utilize something like that, I do suggest that. I do know, though, however, it's not within everyone's means to necessarily always seek out therapy or counseling. Unfortunately, even with sliding scale, sometimes it's just not something that can be afforded depending on one's income level. Even sliding scale sometimes can be like really like, oh my God. But I'm not saying that you need to have a counselor, you need to have a therapist, or you can't do shadow work. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying I think that would very much complement and be conducive to the flow of your process. But even if you're not going to be working with a counselor or a therapist, there are two other things that I think might help. Divination at the very beginning of your process, I think, would be a good idea. However, I don't necessarily suggest doing it for yourself if you can help it. And the reason why is that oftentimes we are so close to a situation that we sort of, when we do divinations for ourselves, we see what we want to see. We may not be as objective. You know, it's kind of hard sometimes to see the forest for the trees when you're deep in the thick of it. So if you do choose to take my advice and maybe consult a divination to get an overall feel of things before you kind of start really getting into the nitty-gritty of your process, I would say seek out someone that you know you can trust, that has a good track record as a reader, that will not make things up, that will not coddle you, that will not lie to you or whatever. You want someone that can be objective, that can convey to you with accuracy and tact what in fact the cards are conveying to them, without any sort of bias, without anything to gain from what they tell you, without any stake in the matter. And I would also suggest journaling. Journaling in respect to really giving yourself an open forum where you can say what you need to say whatever. You can write down things as they occur to you, things as you feel them, things as you think them, whatever during your process. And you can, you know, later on go back, be objective as you're examining things. You can sort of look at it from, you know, the viewpoint of, if this was someone else saying this, like how would I examine that, and how can I explain it? How would I interpret that, or how would I address that if it wasn't me, you know? It may be hard to be objective. That's also another reason why I suggested earlier, you know, maybe working with a therapist or a counselor. But sometimes, you know, we have to really try, because as I said before, this process really does require brutal honesty. Not to the point, maybe I shouldn't have said brutal. You know, you don't have to beat yourself up, but you do need to be honest with yourself. You can't be sugarcoating and coddling yourself to the point where you're not being real, you know, or your process probably won't be as effective as you seek it to be. So, you know, day-to-day journaling is a good thing. I think that is something that would help. But in particular, I feel that where journaling is concerned, I think it would be a great idea to begin your shadow work process by asking yourself some questions and answering them honestly. Some questions you might want to ask yourself, you know, are things like, you know, what is not in flow in my life at this time? What isn't working for me right now? What are some problems that I'm facing? Furthermore, you might want to ask yourself things like, what, if any, sorrows or pains am I feeling? Am I angry at this time? Am I frustrated? Do I feel unfulfilled in any way? These are things that sometimes we sort of don't admit to ourselves readily. We might then go on to write about the sources of these things that we're touching upon in our journaling. You know, do we know the root causes of these things? When did these issues begin for us? Are these things within our power to control or change? I will say also that a lot of times when looking at problems or issues or things that are not in flow, things that bother us, A lot of times we want to say that, oh, we don't have any control, but when we look closer at what's going on, there are aspects to the situations where we do have control to some degree, in some way, in some shape, in some form, whether it's behaviors within ourselves that we can change, whether it's choices that we can make in certain ways, whether it's decisions in regard to how to handle something going on externally, or how to handle the way that maybe others have or do treat us. We have also a choice in the matter of how we react to things, how we allow ourselves to feel in regard to things. It really, while some people may say, no, we don't, no, we don't, I've come to understand and find that a lot of times it really is a simple choice, to allow ourselves to be bothered by something or to shift our focus elsewhere to a more productive or positive aspect of our lives. We can shift our focus somewhere else where it would better serve us in a lot of cases. Instead of allowing ourselves to get riled up about certain things, we really do have the ability to decide how we feel about certain things. You will feel what you allow yourself to feel. No one can make you happy. No one can make you angry. You are at liberty to choose to allow external things or the way that people deal with you or treat you. You have the ability to choose how and if you allow those things to affect you. So these are all things that I think would be helpful to explore in journaling. I also feel that it would help to ask ourselves, are a lot of these things that we're struggling with originating from conscious choices that we ourselves are making or actions that we are taking? Are we also coming from a place of reaction, or fear in regard to what's going on? And finally, I think it would help to write down ways that we can address what we find not to be in flow in our lives. Like, what can we potentially do? Even if it's something you don't think that you can actually do, just list out some possibilities. What are options? There are always options. And then maybe put your journal aside for a day or two, kind of let things be for a minute, and then revisit it, again in a day or two, and look things over objectively. Bear in mind, however, there's not, again, any particular right or wrong way to go about shadow work. And in the case of journaling, you may or may not choose to exactly approach your journaling. If you utilize journaling as a technique in your shadow work, you may not necessarily want to approach it in the way that I have suggested approaching things. You may want to ask yourself different questions, or you may want to just go about your journaling in a different way. That's entirely up to you. Once again, go where you're led. But I do encourage that in whatever way that you do utilize journaling, if you choose to utilize it as part of your shadow work, whatever way you go about that, it should be some way in which you are really introspecting, examining the self, finding objectivity in identifying what is not in flow and what you can do to address what is not in flow. Journaling aside, there are other things you can obviously utilize in your shadow work. Meditation, I think, can be a helpful thing to do, a helpful exercise, regular meditation, especially in regard to particular things that will come up in shadow work. It doesn't hurt to meditate on things that you might feel you need to explore further as they arise along your process, through your journey inward. I also think it may be helpful to you if you have someone who is fairly well balanced and mature that you can feel comfortable speaking to about your process or about things that come up during your process. If you feel that there's someone you can trust that won't run around and shout to the hills what you tell them, communication sometimes can facilitate positive change and growth, during your process of going inward and facing yourself. You don't have to necessarily utilize communication, but I think it does help, because when you're solely going through a process like this by yourself, sometimes, again, as I've said before, objectivity can be difficult. So if you do have someone to kind of bounce your thoughts off of, someone that can listen to you and give you honest feedback, again, as I said, in regard to the divination aspect of things, as long as they have nothing to gain from what they tell you, or as long as they're not coming from a biased position or anything like that in respect to the feedback that they give you, I do think communicating with someone, some trusted individual, would help. That's also, again, why earlier I suggested maybe seeking out, if it is within your ability to do so, a counselor or a therapist, because they tend to, I say tend to, keep things confidential, as long as you're not expressing something that is inherently dangerous to yourself or someone else. Like, as long as you're not expressing desires, let's say, to harm yourself or others. If you were to express something like that, obviously they would have to intervene and get you some help. So they might have to tell someone with the power to help facilitate, whatever it is that you need to keep you and others safe. But other than that, they're not going to run around shouting to the hills what you tell them. So a therapist or counselor would be good in that regard. But if you have someone who is close to you, but who will not bullshit you, who will be a trusted source of support, that would be good. Also, there are many different books available out there that can help to sort of guide you along your inner journey of shadow work. I'm going to show you a few that I'm aware of. These may or may not suit your particular situation, but these are just examples. I'm not saying you have to go get these books and you have to read these books, but I'm going to show you a few books, for example, that are like the sorts of reading material that you might want to seek out in your process of shadow work. One, for example, is To Know Yourself, The Essential Teachings of Swami oh my God, I'm going to totally butcher this name, Satchidananda. This is the cover of the book. Let me read you the blurb on the back. It says, Swami Satchidananda is one of the world's best known and most respected yoga masters. In this inspiring compilation of teachings and stories, he offers guidance for everyday problems in family life and business, and shows how to realize universal consciousness by nature. Universal consciousness. By nature, he says, the mind and body are happy and healthy, peaceful and restful. To know yourself outlines the path to peace of mind and a new, more spiritual way of life. So that's an example, To Know Yourself. And that book is edited by Philip Mandelkorn. I'm going to show you the cover one more time. That's it. I don't know if there are alternate covers. Sometimes in later editions of books there may be alternate covers. Some books may be out of print, but usually if you go to bookseller websites, you can sometimes find used copies, or even on like Amazon.com or eBay or whatever, sometimes you can find books that are out of print, so no worries there. Another example of the sort of book that might help on a shadow work journey might be The Road Less Traveled, A New Psychology of Love, Traditional Values, and Spiritual Growth by M. Scott Peck, MD. It's another book, the sort of book, not necessarily saying you have to get this book again, but this is another sort of book that may, help to facilitate positive change and some insight and realization along your process of shadow work. So what this says, what the blurb on the back says, it says, confronting and solving problems is a painful process, which most of us attempt to avoid. And the very avoidance results in greater pain and an inability to grow both mentally and spiritually. Drawing heavily upon his own professional experience, Dr. M. Scott Peck, a practicing psychiatrist, suggests ways in which confronting and resolving our problems and suffering through the changes can enable us to reach a higher level of self-understanding. Dr. Peck discusses the nature of loving relationships, how to recognize true compatibility, how to distinguish dependency from love, how to become one's own person, how to be a more sensitive parent. It says The Road Less Traveled, a bestseller in hardcover, brilliantly integrates traditional psychological and spiritual insights. The result is a book that can show you how to embrace reality and achieve serenity and fullness in your life. So this is a good example of the sort of reading material that might help out on your shadow work journey. Another example might be something like A New Earth, Awakening to Your Life's Purpose by Eckhart Tolle. The blurb on the back of this book says, with his best-selling spiritual guide, The Power of Now, Eckhart Tolle inspired millions of readers to discover the freedom and joy of a life lived in the now. In A New Earth, Tolle expands on these powerful ideas to show how transcending our ego-based state of consciousness is not only essential to personal happiness, but also the key to ending conflict and suffering throughout the world. Tolle describes how our attachment to the ego creates the dysfunction that leads to anger, jealousy, and unhappiness, and shows readers how to awaken to a new state of consciousness and follow the path to a truly fulfilling existence. Yet another example. This is a book that I actually bought from a library that was selling discarded books years ago. It's a book called The Achilles Syndrome, Transforming Your Weaknesses into Strengths. And this book is by Harold H. Bloomfield, MD. So this is the cover. And the blurb of this book, it says, if you could change at least one thing about yourself to make your life better, what would it be? If you asked your spouse, your children, your friends, or your coworkers what your weak spot is, what would you hear? In The Achilles Syndrome, Harold Bloomfield, MD, the eminent Yale-trained psychiatrist, states that even those of us who seem to function well have an Achilles heel of vulnerability or insecurity that regularly trips us up. Finding that characteristic and working with it will allow us to transform our weaknesses into strengths and thereby find the key to success in work and intimate relationships. In this useful and compassionate book, Dr. Bloomfield shows you how to identify your Achilles heel. Then he provides exercises, case studies, and personal growth techniques for such common Achilles heels as, I'm afraid of getting hurt again. When I look in the mirror, I'm never quite satisfied. I can't stand criticism. I'm always feeling tense and rushed. I wish I could be happier. A powerful psychological principle of this book is what you resist persists. Choosing between a self-defeating resistance and the full expression of your uniqueness is up to you. Your peace of mind, your love relationships, your effectiveness in your work are at stake. Breaking through the Achilles syndrome is a gift you deserve for being courageous enough to admit that to be alive is to be vulnerable. So yeah, that's another great example of the sort of reading material that might help out a shadow work process. It may facilitate positive change and, may be conducive to your process. And there are other books such as, for example, The Little Book of Letting Go, a revolutionary 30-day program to cleanse your mind, lift your spirit, and replenish your soul by Hugh Prather. And the blurb of this book says, In this accessible, friendly book, best-selling author Hugh Prather presents a simple 30-day program to free ourselves from worry, conflict, and painful memories. Prather's unique and powerful approach, based on 30 years' experience, helps us identify and release mental toxins. The result is a mind that embraces freedom and a life that knows peace. So, these are just some examples of the sort of reading material that may complement your journey inward, your self-examination. So if any of these books sounded like something that resonate with you, you might want to look into getting one of these books. Or if there's another book sort of along these lines, the sort of reading material that can help to facilitate introspection, honesty with the self, identifying what is not in flow, and addressing what is not in flow in order to heal, integrate, or process or gain closure in some respects. Hey, if there's another book like that you're aware of, maybe now in your time of doing shadow work is the time to read that, or something like that. That's not to say, of course, that reading the book in itself is going to necessarily turn everything around for you. There is one, I guess you could say, caveat to this. Books of this sort are only as helpful as you allow them to be, in the respect that if you're not doing the work, if you're not really allowing yourself to absorb the guidance that is being offered you, if you're not really utilizing the insights provided to effect changes in your life and in your heart and mind and etc., then the book's really not going to serve you. You have to be willing to do the work. So that's also something you might want to keep in mind if you do utilize reading certain, I guess you could say, like self-help books, in order to kind of guide your journey, your process along. It's really only going to be as effective as you apply what is being shared with you. This topic is one that is so extensive and so unique to each individual that I could probably go on and on and on. This video is already running a little on the long side, but I think suffice it to say, I've at least outlined for you maybe some techniques or hopefully suggestions that you might want to utilize in your own pursuit of shadow work. I also wanted to take a moment to put forth that, just as I said that shadow work is unique to each individual, it's also something that doesn't have like a set time frame. I find that shadow work is not a simple one and done sort of process. It's not like, we're going to undergo it once in our lives and suddenly be these whole integrated, fully functional people that never have to do it again. Instead, I find that shadow work tends to be something, at least in my own experience, and maybe some of you will find the same, I would think, it tends to be something that we will revisit time and time again as we find that we need to. We will undergo periods of shadow work throughout our lives, and the process will take as long as it needs to. Just trust your journey, trust your process, trust your intuition, be honest with yourself. You will know when your process will be sort of, I guess you could say, fulfilled for a time being in each of your intervals of pursuing shadow work. The reason why I felt so compelled to bring forth this topic in this 13 Days of Samhain series is that this time of year really is, I feel, and I think many of you might agree, a great time of year for this sort of work, being that we are confronted with themes, concepts relating to darkness. And darkness tends to, as a polarity, be something in which we find hidden things, less obvious things, things that only in introspection, going inward and downward, do we uncover and grow from facing and exploring. Now, at this point in the video, I am going to share with you some things that I tend to do in my own shadow work. I actually pre-recorded this whole video. I did a whole nother version of this video that I didn't quite like, but I did like the part in the video where I spoke about my own general process of shadow work. So I'm going to transition now into that part of that previous video where I spoke on that. You're going to obviously notice there's going to be a change of scenery. I filmed that in my backyard. So, that's why it's going to be a different setting. But yeah, I'm going to transition us now into that video. Many of you watching this video now might be wondering, how do I undergo shadow work? Well, overall, I tend to do a lot of writing and thinking. Sometimes I do some meditating as well. Not always the kind of meditation where I'm sitting in the lotus position and going into quiet mind. Sometimes I'll kind of meditate while I'm at my job or while I'm taking a walk or whatever. I'll just kind of let my thoughts flow and see where they take me, and I'll sort of observe and explore them. But also, in the process of my shadow work, I tend to focus a lot on self-caring activities. However, in these self-caring activities, I'm not just coddling myself and being a slob. It's not just me sitting on the couch watching episodes of Ghost Adventures eating Haagen-Dazs. Instead, my self-caring activities, they tend to be activities that feed my soul and engage or challenge my mind. They also tend to be things that I don't normally have much time for, so I make time for them. For example, I read, I paint, I write letters to friends who I've fallen out of touch with. And in doing these things, I notice that oftentimes parts of myself that I don't nurture will step forward to be seen. For example, in reading, I will notice that certain passages in books will speak to me, and I will explore within myself, what is it in that passage that has such a profound message for me? Why? What is it in that passage that stirs me in a certain way? Oh, there's a bug in my hair. Sorry. Okay. Also, when I paint, the way that I paint, I don't plan my paintings. At least I generally don't. I don't sketch them out beforehand. I paint with acrylic paint on canvas, and I just kind of freeform paint in layers, and I just let the painting evolve as I go until I feel that it's done. And as I'm creating the piece, I will pay attention to the sort of, I don't critique myself and I don't try to control the process, but I will notice, like, what colors am I using, what sort of energies or vibrations do those colors tend to have. Like, am I using a lot of reds and like fiery colors? Is that speaking of or alluding to some sort of anger inside of myself? Am I using a lot of like gray tones and very muted tones? Is that speaking of maybe some part of myself that is unhappy, or that is maybe feeling a bit subdued? Things like that. I will also pay attention to the shapes and any kind of symbols or imagery that I create. What symbolism is in this picture that I'm making, that I'm allowing to flow from me, and what is it exactly saying about my inner state? Is it reflective of, let's say, an inner state of turmoil or happiness or what have you? And I'll kind of explore that and see where that takes me. As to the letters that I write to friends that I've fallen out of touch with, in a sense, when I'm writing to them, I can sort of observe my thoughts, and also the process in which I'm writing these thoughts. It's like you always know if you're holding back or if you're being truly honest and genuine. And then also, sometimes things that come out in writing, they're things that maybe you've never quite said out loud, but you've been feeling. Like I notice these sometimes in my letters when I write to friends I've fallen out of touch with, or when I just, write to people that I'm just, back and forth with by snail mail. I will notice sometimes my thoughts will kind of just naturally unfurl, and some of them are thoughts that I hadn't even consciously, I guess, thought to myself, but only in speaking to someone else do they come forward. So I guess that's a general summary of how I tend to go about my shadow work. It's not really specific, but I don't think I need to be specific. I think at this point I've stated probably a good deal about shadow work to give you at least a beginning point on your journey, should you wish to pursue this at this time. So now I think maybe it would serve us well to shift our focus to the question of the day. This one's going to be in regard to reading material, as I was mentioning that might be conducive to shadow work process. I invite you all, if you're aware of any wonderful introspective, sort of like self-help, self-improvement, insightful sort of books, I invite you all to go down in the comments and mention books that you recommend, that you have read, that you think are excellent sources of, that might be excellent sources of guidance for others. I think this would be an excellent question of the day for the reason that sometimes there are excellent books out there, but we've just never come across them. So maybe by your mentioning a book that you have found helpful, insightful, really like groundbreaking in your experience and your journey, maybe you can kind of help others who could really find some benefit if they were aware of the books that you, or the book or books that you mention. So that's your question of the day. What book or books would you recommend to anyone that happens to be on a shadow work process? Is there any great writing that you have come across in your life, in your, general journey spiritually, or even in a mundane sense, that you have found to be really mind-opening, really enlightening, really beneficial? And journaling-wise, for our Samhain journal, this time of year, I know that fear tends to be an overall theme. We tend to associate or confront fears. We tend to associate fear itself with this time of year. I think a lot of people in general, and I think we tend to confront a lot of fears and things just in general in this time of year, being that Halloween in particular tends to be like a real spooky holiday, and that being one that is sort of parallel to or sometimes amalgamated with Samhain. So I invite you all for your journaling exercise to write about your fears. Maybe ask yourself, like, what do I fear? Why do I fear that? What exactly are these fears if I were to strip away the subjective fear in relation to what scares me? What are they essentially? What are they really? And so on and so forth. I suggest, not suggest, but I invite you to just really write about your fears, explore them. In examining your fears, you will begin to develop a different sort of perspective of them. Maybe they will be a little less potent for you. You know, maybe they will hold you back a little less over time. But I think, at least in beginning to examine them, I think that's a healthy process of sort of deconstructing them so they are less overwhelming, I guess you could say, to put it as well as I can. I also want to remind you all to not forget, check out your witchy link of the day below in the description. And yeah, I guess that sums up the the entirety of today's video, today's episode. So, until tomorrow, until our next exchange, you all stay awesome. I hope that for those of you who wish to undergo some shadow work at this time, I hope that you will find some profound insights. And I bless your journey of healing, your journey inward. And yeah, until tomorrow, blessed be in Ashe, and bye-bye for now.